Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Today, we're looking at Scaling Scrum.
Okay.
So how to take what's designed for a small team and make it work when you've got a bigger project, something more complex. We're using the Nexus Framework for Scaling Scrum as our source material.
Right.
And it's all about this thing called Nexus, which was actually created by one of Scrum's co-creators.
Yeah.
So the big question, I guess, is Nexus just another one of those trendy buzzwords? Or is there really something valuable here for teams that are trying to scale?
Well, the key to scaling agile and doing it well, I think, is really about dependencies between the teams.
Okay.
Reducing those dependencies. And that's what Nexus is all about. It gives you a simple set of extensions to Scrum.
Okay.
And that helps these teams, even if you've got a bigger group, 3 to 9 teams,
Right.
to all work together well, from a single product backlog.
So before we get too deep into Nexus, I think it might be good to remind ourselves why Scrum is so popular in the first place, when it comes to agile. I mean, it's not just another framework that's kind of come and gone.
Right. I mean, you've got something like 90% of agile teams, according to Forrester research, are using Scrum.
Wow.
And it's not just hype. I think Scrum is so adaptable because it's based on principles and values.
Okay.
It's not just a rigid set of rules,
Right.
And, with the 3 roles, the 5 events, the 3 artifacts, it's relatively easy to understand and wrap your head around.
It's user-friendly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's based on empiricism.
Okay.
So knowledge that comes from experience. And you make decisions based on what you know. And then, from there, you've got that transparency, inspection, and adaptation.
So it's adaptable, it's user-friendly. That explains the popularity. But I'm still wondering, why not just add more Scrum teams, as the project gets bigger? Why do we even need something like Nexus?
Because just throwing more people at a problem doesn't automatically make things better, or even faster for that matter.
Right.
In fact, the book points out that the FBI Sentinel project, they actually did better when they scaled down.
Oh, wow.
And implemented a Scrum approach.
Interesting.
Because the initial project, when it was bigger, it was just too complex.
I see.
You couldn't manage it effectively.
So it's almost like trying to fit, a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly.
You keep trying to force it, it's just not going to work.
Exactly.
And then the communication overhead probably just becomes a nightmare.
Oh, absolutely.
When you've got, too many teams trying to talk to each other.
It's like, the more people you add, the more complex that communication gets.
Right.
Think of it like a network.
Yeah.
Where each person is like a node.
Mm-hmm.
If you have too many nodes, the network gets bogged down.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Nexus helps streamline that by adding some key elements.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these key elements.
Yeah.
What's different in Nexus compared to, just regular Scrum?
One of the key differences is they introduced this thing called the Nexus Integration Team.
Okay.
Or NIT. And it's a small team, and it's made up of people from each of the Scrum teams and the product owner. And they laser focus on making sure that all the teams integrate their work smoothly.
So it's almost like a dedicated team of troubleshooters or problem solvers who can see the potential conflicts and dependencies before they derail the whole project.
Exactly.
But wouldn't that add like another layer of bureaucracy?
Well, and that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
But the NIT is not about, micromanaging or adding red tape.
Right.
It's about removing impediments.
Okay.
And enabling those Scrum teams to really collaborate well.
I got it.
So it's more about facilitation and support than control.
So they're like the oil that keeps the engine running.
Exactly.
Okay, what else sets Nexus apart?
Well, they also introduce the Nexus Sprint Backlog, which is basically a visual plan for the sprint.
Okay.
And it lays out all the work,
Uh-huh.
all the dependencies between the teams,
Yeah.
so that everybody can see the big picture
Right.
and where those potential bottlenecks might be.
That's helpful.
And then, of course, they adapt the traditional Scrum events, like
Yeah.
the daily Scrum and the sprint review, to work for multiple teams.
Now, the book used a case study, right, of a startup building a home security system.
That's right. Yeah.
Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah.
What were their scaling challenges, and how did Nexus help them?
So they start with a single Scrum team.
Okay.
As the project grows, they realize, okay, we got to scale up.
Right.
So the case study shows how they actually split the team, how they managed that increasing complexity as things got bigger, and importantly, how they kept their product vision unified.
Yeah.
Even though they had multiple teams working on different parts of the system.
It's like that saying divide and conquer, right?
Exactly.
But you have to make sure that everyone is conquering the right territory.
Right.
And that those territories all kind of connect together and make sense.
Exactly. And Nexus helps with that.
Okay, so how did Nexus help them divide up that work and then keep everybody on the same page?
Well, they used a few key techniques that are central to Nexus.
All right.
One of them is impact mapping.
Okay.
And what impact mapping does is it helps link the high-level business goals to the specific deliverables that each team is working on.
So everybody knows what they're working on and why.
Exactly. So for example, this startup, their goal was to achieve a high net promoter score.
Okay.
Right. So impact mapping helped them see which features would directly contribute to that goal.
So it's like a roadmap to make sure everybody's going in the right direction.
It is, exactly.
I imagine that kind of clarity is so important when you've got multiple teams.
Right.
Each team could be focused on their little piece and maybe lose sight of the big picture.
Exactly, yeah.
What other techniques did they use?
Another one is story mapping.
Okay.
And that helps the teams understand the big picture of how all those individual features fit into the overall user journey.
Right.
So the book shows how the startup use story mapping to plan the different phases of their product launch.
Okay.
And even to find gaps in their understanding of what the customers needed.
So it's like a narrative that everybody can follow.
Yeah.
To make sure that all the pieces of the puzzle fit together and make a cohesive whole.
Exactly.
But then how do you break down the work itself?
Right.
How do you keep from overwhelming these teams with these massive chunks of functionality?
Well, that's where refinement comes in.
Okay.
And that's all about taking those large product backlog items and slicing them into smaller, more manageable pieces.
Okay.
But it's not about randomly chopping things up.
Right.
It's about teams collaborating to make sure that those smaller pieces still deliver value.
Okay.
And, help you get to that overall goal.
I can see how that would be really helpful for larger teams.
Right.
To break things down that way.
Right.
And, to kind of find that sweet spot where the tasks are small enough to manage, but still big enough that they're meaningful.
Right.
But doesn't that create more of a risk of dependencies between the teams?
Well, it can, but that's where Nexus really tries to keep everybody on the same page with a lot of visualization.
Okay.
So that you spot those potential roadblocks early on.
Got it.
So they'll use tools like cross-team refinement boards and product backlog tree maps to make sure that everybody can see the dependencies, see the progress, and see where those potential bottlenecks might be.
Right.
It's about being proactive, identifying those things before they become big problems.
So it's all about transparency and communication.
Yeah, exactly.
What about the teams themselves?
Yeah.
How do you structure teams effectively when you're working within a Nexus?
That's a great question. And the book explores the tension between specializing teams by their technical skills, what they call component teams, versus creating more flexible teams that can work on any feature, which they call feature teams.
So it's the classic trade-off between specialization and flexibility.
Exactly.
Which approach did this startup in the case study end up using?
Well, they started with component teams.
Yeah.
But as the project evolved, they needed to be more agile.
Okay.
So they actually transitioned to feature teams
Interesting.
to reduce the handoffs and become more adaptable.
So it sounds like there's no one perfect answer when it comes to team structure.
No, not at all.
It depends on the project.
It really does depend on the project, yeah.
But wouldn't changing the team structure in the middle of a project just create chaos?
Well, you're right. Any organizational change is going to have challenges.
Right.
And they did experience some growing pains, especially because they also expanded and brought in some remote teams, in different countries.
Right.
So, they had to deal with communication issues, cultural differences, time zone challenges.
The joys of globalization.
Exactly.
But if I'm understanding this correctly, Nexus helped them address those challenges.
Yes.
Through things like the Nexus Daily Scrum and the NIT's focus on, problem solving.
Right. And the book even provides specific examples of how they did that. Using those techniques to uncover and resolve the integration issues, like early on.
So it sounds like Nexus is more than just a theoretical framework. It actually gives people some tools and techniques to solve real-world problems.
Exactly.
But no methodology is perfect, right?
Right.
What kind of limitations or drawbacks did they run into?
Well, they experience the same issue that a lot of companies face, even if they're using Scrum, and that is technical debt.
Yeah.
That tendency to prioritize new features over maintaining a really clean and manageable code base.
Right.
And of course, over time, that creates problems.
It's like constantly adding new furniture to your house without ever cleaning or decluttering.
That's a great analogy.
Eventually, you can't even walk around.
Right, exactly.
So how did they handle this technical debt issue within the Nexus framework?
That's where this concept of scrumbling comes in.
Okay.
Which is basically a pattern for responding to emergencies by temporarily halting the normal sprint work.
Okay.
And focusing all your effort on resolving that critical issue.
So you're calling a timeout when the team needs to regroup and tackle a problem.
Exactly.
Can you give me a real-world example of what that might look like?
Yeah, so the book describes how they used scrumbling to address a critical integration issue.
Okay.
They had an external security service provider, and their initial approach just wasn't working.
Right.
And they were having all these delays and communication breakdowns.
So they had to get a pivot.
Exactly. So instead of pushing forward with their regular sprint goals, they activated their scrumbling plan and dedicated a whole sprint to resolving that integration issue.
So they took a step back to fix the problem?
They did.
Before moving forward.
Exactly.
Which is, I guess, a key part of being agile.
It is.
That flexibility.
Right.
But scrumbling isn't just about putting out fires, is it?
No, it's also about learning from those situations.
Okay.
And preventing them from happening again.
So once they've kind of put out the fire, they go back and figure out how to prevent it next time.
Exactly. They'll hold a retrospective to analyze what went wrong, why it happened, and how to prevent it in the future.
It's about turning those challenging situations into learning opportunities.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So let's talk about that last stage of the Nexus journey.
Okay.
That retrospective on the scaling process as a whole. What does the book tell us about how to do that well?
Well, they emphasize that it's important to hold that comprehensive Nexus retrospective, even if the project went well, even if it was a success. It's about taking that step back and reflecting on the whole journey of scaling.
Right.
You know, figure out what worked well, what could be improved, what lessons were learned.
Got it.
And they actually used a really structured approach.
Okay.
Similar to the retrospective board that we talked about, to capture their insights and figure out, you know, how to make things better going forward.
So they're essentially taking those same Scrum principles of transparency, inspection, and adaptation.
Right.
And they're applying it to the Nexus framework itself.
Exactly.
It's continuous improvement for the process itself.
Well, yes, it is.
Okay, so we've gone through the basics of Nexus and how it addresses these challenges of scaling.
Yeah.
In part 2, we're going to take a closer look at how these principles are actually applied.
Sounds good.
You know, in the real world.
Okay.
We'll look at specific examples and hopefully give you some actionable takeaways that you can use in your own projects.
Right.
So stick around for more on the world of Nexus.
So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of these specific techniques that make Nexus work.
Okay.
One that really stands out is this Nexus integration team.
Right.
Or NIT for short.
Yeah, we talked about them a little bit before.
Right.
They're like the glue that holds everything together.
Yeah.
But how do they actually do that?
Right.
Do they just like sit in meetings all day telling everybody what to do?
No, not at all. The book makes it very clear that the NIT is not another layer of management.
Okay.
It's not about micromanaging the Scrum teams.
Got it.
It's about identifying and removing impediments, really fostering communication and ensuring a smooth flow of work between all the teams.
So they're more like facilitators or problem solvers.
Right, exactly.
Than like taskmasters.
Exactly.
What kind of specific tools or techniques do they use?
Well, one of their key tools is this Nexus Sprint Backlog.
Okay.
And it basically provides this holistic view
of
all the work being done across all the Scrum teams during a sprint.
So it's like a map that shows all the dependencies so everybody can see who needs to do what and when.
It is. Yeah, it's like a map.
Okay, that makes sense.
That highlights those dependencies. So you don't want them hidden. You want them to be right out there so you can address them.
How is that different from the traditional Scrum of Scrums meeting?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that accomplish the same thing?
Well, Scrum of Scrums can be helpful.
Yeah.
But the Nexus Daily Scrum has a different purpose.
Okay.
It's actually held before the individual Scrum team daily Scrums.
Okay.
And it focuses specifically on these cross-team integration issues.
Okay, so you're addressing the integration challenges up front.
Right, yeah.
Before they become big problems.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the Nexus Daily Scrum being focused on integration. But what about presenting the final product?
Right.
You know, the integrated product.
Yeah.
How does the sprint review work when you're in a Nexus environment?
Well, the Nexus Sprint Review actually shifts the focus away from what individual teams accomplish. to showcasing the integrated increment as a whole.
I see.
So all the Scrum teams come together
Right.
and they demonstrate the combined results of their work.
It's a much more holistic approach than having each team present their piece separately.
Right, it is.
What about situations where maybe stakeholders can't be there in person?
Yeah.
Especially, with distributed teams.
Right.
Is there any flexibility with that?
Nexus is flexible with that. The book suggests that you could record the sprint review demonstration so people can see it later.
Sure.
Or you can circulate summaries of the key accomplishments beforehand so everybody has that information.
Right.
So the goal is to make sure everybody has access and can provide feedback.
Yeah, regardless of location or time zones.
Exactly.
So you're adapting the process to fit the project and the people involved.
Right.
What about the sprint retrospective?
Yeah.
Does Nexus have any unique perspective on that?
Yeah, the Nexus Sprint Retrospective encourages all the teams to come together.
Okay.
Share their lessons learned, identify opportunities for improvement.
Right.
But it's at the Nexus level, not just the individual team level.
So you're looking at those systemic issues.
Right, exactly.
That might be affecting multiple teams.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm seeing a pattern here.
Yeah.
It seems like Nexus is about taking those familiar Scrum events and adapting them to make it easier for teams to communicate and work together.
You got it.
But it's more than just adapting events, right?
Right.
There's also all these tools and techniques that kind of streamline the whole process.
And a lot of emphasis on visualization.
Yeah, visualization is such a powerful tool.
It is.
You can see patterns you might not otherwise notice.
It helps you make sense of complex information.
What kind of visualization techniques does Nexus recommend?
Well, one that's particularly helpful is the product backlog tree map. And that allows the teams to see the size and the complexity and how complete the product backlog items are.
Okay.
Basically, they're represented as boxes.
Yep.
And the size of the box shows how much effort is estimated.
So you can see at a glance which tasks are going to take the most effort.
Exactly.
That's much easier than just looking at a list.
Right.
And then you could even color code them.
You can.
To show their level of completeness.
Exactly.
Okay, so you can see what's in progress, what's ready to go, what's blocked.
Right.
That's a great way to make sure everybody's on the same page.
It is, yeah.
What other visualization techniques do they use?
Another good one is the cross-team refinement board.
Okay.
And it's designed for those collaborative sessions.
Right.
Where teams break down those large product backlog items into smaller tasks.
It's about dividing up the work efficiently.
Exactly.
So visualization is one thing, but what about communication?
Yeah.
Especially when you've got teams in different locations and time zones. How do you make sure everybody's talking to each other?
Well, Nexus encourages frequent and transparent communication. Different channels.
Like video conferencing, instant messaging, things like that.
All those. Yeah.
So you're going beyond just the formal Scrum events.
Right.
And really trying to foster a culture of communication.
Yeah, exactly.
But even with the best communication, dependencies are going to come up.
They are.
How do you manage those dependencies and keep them from derailing the project?
Well, Nexus takes a proactive approach.
Okay.
It starts with identifying potential dependencies during that product backlog refinement.
Okay.
Often using visualization tools like the cross-team refinement board.
Okay.
Once you've identified those dependencies, the teams can work together to minimize their impact.
Okay.
Maybe by breaking down tasks differently, adjusting priorities, or even finding ways to work in parallel.
So you're acknowledging that dependencies are inevitable, and you're putting a system in place to deal with them. Now, let's talk about technical debt.
Yeah.
That's a challenge that often comes up when you're scaling, no matter what methodology you're using.
Right.
How does Nexus address that?
Nexus promotes transparency about technical debt.
Okay.
You want to make it visible. You want to talk about its potential impact.
You don't want to ignore it.
No, absolutely not.
You have to be proactive.
Right.
And actually allocate time to deal with it.
Exactly, just like any other task.
So you're treating technical debt like a real part of the project.
Yeah.
Not just something you hope will go away on its own.
Right.
You mentioned something earlier called a health check model.
I did, yeah.
How does that relate to managing technical debt?
Well, the health check model, it's actually inspired by Spotify.
Okay.
And it's a way for teams to regularly assess how they're doing.
Okay.
Including the health of their code base.
It's like checkup for the project.
It is. It's like a regular checkup.
Identify potential problems before they get too big.
Exactly, including technical debt.
Right.
So you can address those issues early on.
It's like preventative maintenance.
It is. Yeah.
Always better to fix the small problems
than
wait till they become big problems.
Exactly.
Speaking of headaches, what about those unexpected situations that can pop up and kind of throw a project off track?
Yeah.
How does Nexus handle those curveballs?
That's where scrumbling comes in.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
I did, yeah.
It's like an emergency response plan.
Exactly.
So when a critical issue comes up, that needs immediate attention, the teams can kind of put everything else on hold and focus on solving that problem.
Exactly.
Can you give me an example of how that might work in the real world?
Yeah, so the book actually describes how the startup used scrumbling to address an integration issue they had with an external security service provider. And their first approach wasn't working. They were having delays, communication breakdowns. So they decided to activate their scrumbling plan. And they dedicated a whole sprint to solving that integration issue.
So they hit the pause button to fix the problem before moving on.
Exactly.
But scrumbling isn't just about putting out fires.
Right. It's about learning from those experiences and trying to prevent them from happening again.
So once you've resolved that immediate crisis, you take a step back and figure out what went wrong. And how to avoid it next time.
Exactly. You hold a retrospective to analyze what happened, why it happened, and how to prevent it from happening again.
It's about becoming more resilient as a team.
It is, yeah.
Now, let's talk about that final stage of the Nexus journey, that retrospective on the scaling process as a whole. What kind of insights does the book give us on how to do that effectively?
Well, they emphasize that it's really important to hold a Nexus retrospective, even if the project was a success. It's about stepping back and reflecting on the whole journey. Figure out what worked well, what could be improved, what lessons were learned.
You're applying those same continuous improvement principles to the Nexus framework itself.
Exactly.
Recognizing that there's always room for growth.
Always room for improvement, yeah.
What specific techniques did they use for their Nexus retrospective?
They used a very structured approach, similar to the retrospective board. We talked about that. To capture their insights, identify those actionable improvements. You know, they celebrated their successes, but they also acknowledged their shortcomings.
It's about being honest with yourself about what worked and what didn't.
Exactly, and viewing those challenges as opportunities for learning.
So it sounds like continuous improvement isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process.
It is.
All right, so we've explored the Nexus framework. We've talked about the agile mindset. And we've touched on how important trust is when you're working in a scaled environment. But let's wrap things up by bringing it back to our listeners. What's the one key takeaway? What should they be thinking about as they consider these concepts for their own projects?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that scaling Scrum isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Nexus is a really valuable framework. But it's not a magic bullet. And the first step is to really honestly assess whether scaling is even necessary.
That's a good point.
Sometimes keeping things simple is the best approach.
I mean, scaling adds complexity.
It does.
But you really have to weigh the costs and benefits. Don't just scale for the sake of scaling.
Exactly.
You make sure it aligns with your goals and your organization's structure.
Exactly.
And if you do decide to scale, remember that Nexus is a toolkit. It's not a set of rigid rules. It's a set of guidelines and practices that you can adapt to your own needs. So don't be afraid to experiment. Find what works best for your teams and your projects.
That's a great reminder. There's no one right way to do this.
You have to find what works for your specific situation.
You do.
And as you embark on that scaling journey, keep those agile values in mind.
Absolutely.
Transparency, collaboration, self-organization, and continuous improvement.
All those,
And above all, remember that scaling Scrum is really about people.
It is.
It's about creating a culture where individuals and teams can thrive, work together effectively, and deliver great results.
It is.
It's been a really interesting deep dive into the world of Nexus.
It has.
I hope our listeners feel like they've got the knowledge and the inspiration to tackle the challenges of scaling and unlock the potential of their Scrum teams.
And remember, it's not just about doing Scrum. It's about being agile.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of Agile and beyond. So we've spent some time, unpacking this Nexus framework, talking about roles, events, tools. But as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to get your thoughts on the bigger picture. Is Nexus just a recipe for scaling? Or is there something more to it?
I think that's a great question. And the book really makes the point that scaling Scrum successfully is not just about implementing a framework.
Right.
It's about creating the right mindset.
Okay.
The right culture.
You're talking about that agile mindset we hear so much about.
Yeah.
Transparency, collaboration, continuous improvement. But how do those values really play out when you've got multiple teams,
Well,
in a scaled environment?
Nexus really emphasizes self-organization,
Okay.
both at the team level and at the Nexus level as a whole.
So you're empowering these teams to make decisions, solve problems, own their work.
Without needing to be micromanaged.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Micromanagement never works well.
Right, it doesn't.
But wouldn't self-organization just lead to chaos when you've got a big complex project?
Well, that's where trust comes in.
Okay.
Nexus really highlights the importance of building trust.
Yeah.
Not just between individuals, but between teams.
Okay.
And between the Nexus and the stakeholders.
You're right. I think trust is often overlooked.
It is.
When people are trying to implement all these processes and tools.
Right.
But if you don't have trust, even the best framework won't work.
Exactly.
So how do you actually build trust within a Nexus?
Right.
Especially when you've got these teams spread out all over the place.
Yeah, the book offers some practical advice on that.
All right.
One that really stood out to me was celebrating successes together.
Okay.
Both big and small.
Yeah, it's easy to forget to celebrate the wins.
Yeah, it is.
Especially the small ones.
Especially when you're in the thick of things.
But those celebrations, they're important.
They are.
For morale and team spirit.
Yeah, it reminds people that they're part of something bigger.
What other trust-building tips does the book give us?
Another one is fostering a culture where it's safe to make mistakes.
Okay.
And to learn from those mistakes.
Right, because nobody's perfect.
Right.
And in complex projects, mistakes are going to happen.
They are.
It's how you respond to them that matters.
Exactly, because if people are afraid to admit their mistakes, they're going to try to hide them.
Yeah. And then that just leads to bigger problems.
Exactly.
But if you create that environment where people feel safe acknowledging their errors, you can turn those mistakes into learning opportunities.
You can, absolutely.
So we've explored the Nexus framework. We've talked about the agile mindset, the importance of trust.
Yeah.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm going to bring it back to our listeners.
Okay.
What's that key takeaway that they should be thinking about?
I think the most important takeaway is that scaling Scrum is not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
Nexus is a great framework, but it's not a magic bullet.
It's not going to solve all your problems.
No, and the first step is to really honestly assess whether scaling is even necessary.
Yeah.
Sometimes, the simplest approach is the best approach.
Yeah. Scaling adds complexity.
It does.
You got to weigh those costs and benefits.
You do.
Don't just scale because everybody else is doing it.
Right.
Make sure it makes sense for your organization.
And if you do decide to scale,
yeah,
remember that Nexus is a toolkit.
Okay.
It's not a rigid set of rules.
Right.
It's a set of guidelines and practices that you can adapt to your own needs.
So it's about finding what works for you.
It is.
And as you go on that scaling journey, keep those agile values at the forefront.
Yeah.
Transparency, collaboration, self-organization, continuous improvement.
All those things. Yeah.
And remember, scaling Scrum is really about people.
It is.
It's about creating that culture where people and teams can thrive.
And collaborate and deliver great results.
It's been a great deep dive into Nexus.
It has.
I hope our listeners feel equipped to navigate the challenges of scaling and to unlock that full potential of their Scrum teams.
I hope so too.
Any final words of wisdom?
Remember, it's not just about doing Scrum.
It's about being agile.
Exactly.
Well said. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the world of Agile. See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.